welcome to the final episode of this season of BeFm Drama. I'm your host, Ryan Estrada. We're at the very end of our mini-series of Edgar Allan Poe stories. This time we're bringing you part 2 of our adaptation of Some Words with a Mummy. Last time we heard the tale of a couple of nerdy scientists who have had a few too many brown stouts, get a little tipsy, and decide to hook an ancient mummy up to a battery just to see what happens. What happened was that the mummy reflexively kicked one of them out the window, woke up, called them jerks for messing with his body, but then he was chill. He was a little cold, so they dressed him up in an adorable little outfit and took him over to the fire, poured him some wine, gave him a cigar, and prepared to chat. This time on the show, we learned what they talked about. Since this is a comedy, instead of the conversation falling to horror or even acknowledging for more than a moment how insane the situation is, the two men immediately proceed arguing over whose civilization was better. Please enjoy Laura McLucky, Abe Puri, and I. Please enjoy Laura McLucky, Abe Puri, and I in part 2 of Some Words with a Mummy.
The doctor, therefore, gave him his arm and led him to a comfortable chair by the fire, while the doctor rang the bell upon the spot and ordered a supply of cigars and wine. The conversation soon grew animated. Much curiosity was, of course, expressed in regard to the somewhat remarkable fact of his still remaining alive.
I should have thought that it is high time you were dead.
Why? I'm a little more than 700 years old. My father lived 1,000 and was by no means in his dotage when he died.
Oh, no, but my remark had no reference to your age at the period of interment. I'm willing to grant, in fact, that you're still a young man, and my allusion was to the immensity of time during which, by your own showing, you must have been done up in asphaltum.
What?
In, asphaltum?
Ah, yes. I have some faint notion of what you mean. It might be made to answer, no doubt, but in my time we employed scarcely anything else than the bichloride of mercury.
But we are especially at a loss to understand how it happens that, having been dead and buried in Egypt 5,000 years ago, you're here today, all alive and looking so delightfully well.
Had I been, as you say, dead, it is more than probable that dead I should still be. For I perceive you are yet in the infancy of calvinism, and cannot accomplish with it for what was a common thing among us in the old days. But the fact is, I fell into catalepsy, and it was considered by my best friends that I was either dead or should be. They accordingly embalmed me at once. I presume you are aware of the chief principle of the embalming process?
Why, not altogether?
Why, I perceive a deplorable condition of ignorance. Well, I cannot enter into details just now, but it is necessary to explain that to embalm, properly speaking, in Egypt was to arrest indefinitely all the animal functions subjected to the process. I use the word animal in its widest sense. To be brief, in whatever condition the individual was at the period of embalmment, in that condition he remained.
But what does this have to do with you being alive?
Why, it is a general custom in Egypt to deprive a corpse before embalmment of its bowels and brains. Had I not been a scarabus, therefore, I should have been without bowels and brains. And without it, it is inconvenient to live.
Well, it's not improbable then, from what you've explained, that among the catacombs near the Nile there maybe exist other mummies of the Scarabaeus tribe in a condition of vitality?
There could be no question of it. All the scarabaei embalmed accidentally while alive are alive now. Even some of those purposely so embalmed may have been overlooked by their executors and still remain in the tomb.
Will you be kind enough to explain what you mean by purposely so embalmed?
With great pleasure. The usual duration of man's life in my time was about 800 years. Few men died, unless by most extraordinary accidents, before the age of 600. Few lived longer than a decade of centuries, but 8 were considered the natural term. After the discovery of the embalming principle, as I have already described to you, it occurred to our philosophers that a laudable curiosity might be gratified, and, at the same time, the interests of science much advanced, by living this natural term in installments. In the case of history, indeed, experience demonstrated in something of this kind was indispensable. An historian, for example, having attained the age of 500, would write a book with great labor and then get himself carefully embalmed, leaving instructions to his executors, pro tem, that they should cause him to be revivified after the lapse of a certain period, say 500 or 600 years. Resuming existence at the expiration of this time, he would invariably find his great work converted into a species of haphazard notebook. That is to say, into a kind of literary arena for the conflicting guesses, riddles, and personal squabbles of whole herds of exasperated commentators. These guesses, etc., which passed under the name of annotations or emendations, were found so completely to have enveloped, distorted, and overwhelmed the text, that the author had to go about with a lantern to discover his own book. When discovered, it was never worth the trouble of the search. After rewriting it throughout, it was regarded as the bounden duty of the historian to set himself to work immediately in correcting, from his own private knowledge and experience, the traditions of the day concerning the epoch at which he had originally lived. Now, this process of rescription and personal rectification, pursued by various individual sages from time to time, had the effect of preventing our history from degenerating into absolute fable.
I beg your pardon, sir, but may I presume to interrupt for one moment?
By all means, sir.
I merely wish to ask you a question. You mentioned the historian's personal correction of traditions respecting his own epoch. Pray, sir, on an average, what proportion were usually found to be right?
They were generally discovered to be precisely on par with the facts recorded in the unrewritten history themselves. That is to say, not one individual iota of either was ever known, under any circumstances, to be not totally and radically wrong.
But since it's quite clear that at least 5,000 years have elapsed since your entombment, I take it for granted that your histories at that period, if not your traditions, were sufficiently explicit on that one topic of universal interest, the creation, which took place, as I presume you're aware, only about 10 centuries before.
Sir, the ideas you have suggested are to me, I confess, utterly novel. During my time, I never knew anyone to entertain so singular a fancy as that the universe, or this world if you will have it so, ever had a beginning at all.
Well, the long duration of human life in your time, together with the occasional practice of passing it, as you've explained, in installments, must have had indeed a strong tendency to the general development and conglomeration of knowledge. I presume, therefore, that we are to attribute the marked inferiority of the old Egyptians in all particulars of science when compared to the moderns, and more especially the Yankees, altogether to the superior solidity of the Egyptian skull.
I confess again that I am somewhat at a loss to comprehend you. Pray, to what particulars of science do you allude?
We have studied phrenology and the marvels of animal magnetism.
Nonsense! Those ideas flourished and faded in Egypt so long ago as to have been nearly forgotten.
Were your people able to calculate eclipses?
Yes.
Well, what about astronomy? Did you have burning glasses and lenses? Could you even manufacture glass?
Do you moderns possess any such microscopes as would enable you to cut cameos in the style of the Egyptians?
Look at our architecture. Look at the Bowling Green fountain in New York. Or, if this be too vast a contemplation, regard for a moment the Capitol at Washington, D.C.
I regret not being able to remember, just at this moment, the precise dimensions of any one of the principal buildings of the city of Aznak, whose foundations were laid in the night of time, but the ruins of which were still standing at the epoch of my entombment, in a vast plain of the sand to the westward of Thebes. One was affixed to an inferior palace in a kind of suburb called Karnak, consisted of 144 columns, 37 feet in circumference, and 25 feet apart. The approach to this portico from the Nile was through an avenue 2 miles long, composed of sphinxes, statues, and obelisks, 20, 60, and 100 feet in height. The palace itself, as well as I can remember, was in one direction 2 miles long, and might have been altogether about 7 in circuit. Its walls were richly painted over, within and without, with hieroglyphics. I would not pretend to assert that even 50 or 60 of the doctors' capitals might have been built within these walls. But I am by no means sure that 200 or 300 of them might not have been squeezed in with some trouble. That palace at Karnak was an insignificant little building after all. However, I cannot conscientiously refuse to admit the ingenuity, magnificence, and superiority of the fountain at the Bowling Green, as you describe it. Nothing like it had ever been seen in Egypt or elsewhere.
Well, what do you have to say to our railroads?
Nothing in particular. They were rather slight, rather ill-conceived and clumsily put together. It could not be compared, of course, with the vast, level, direct, iron-grooved causeways upon which the Egyptians conveyed entire temples and solid obelisks of 150 feet in altitude.
What of our gigantic mechanical forces?
I agree that you moderns know something in that way. But how should you have gone to work in getting up the imposts on the lintels, or even the little palace at Karnak?
What of our steel?
Could your steel have executed the sharp carved work seen on the obelisks, and which was brought together by edged tools of copper?
Doctor, go get my copy of Dial and he can read out of it a chapter or two about the great movement of progress.
Great movements were awfully common things in my day. And as for progress, it was at one time quite a nuisance. But it never progressed.
But you must appreciate the great beauty and importance of democracy and of advantages we enjoy in living where there is no king.
A great while ago, there had occurred something of a very similar sort. 13 Egyptian provinces determined all at once to be free and to set a magnificent example to the rest of mankind. They assembled their wise men and concocted the most ingenious constitution it is possible to conceive. For a while, they managed remarkably well, only their habit of bragging was prodigious. The thing ended, however, in the consolidation of the 13 states, with some 15 or 20 others, in the most odious and insupportable despotism that was ever heard of upon the face of the earth.
Well, you didn't know about steam.
Are you really such a fool as to not know that modern steam engine is derived from the invention of Hero through Solomon de Caus?
Would the people of Egypt seriously pretend to rival the moderns in the all-important particular of dress?
The Count, at this, glanced downwards to the straps of his pantaloons, and then taking hold at the end of one of his coattails, held it up close to his eyes for some minutes. Letting it fall at last, his mouth extended itself very gradually from ear to ear, but I do not remember that he said anything in the way of reply. Hereupon, we recovered our spirits, and the doctor, approaching the mummy with great dignity.
Come on, candidly, upon your honor as a gentleman, have the Egyptians ever, at any period, mastered the manufacture of, either lozenges or mints?
We looked with profound anxiety for an answer, but in vain. It was not forthcoming. The Egyptian blushed and hung down his head. Never was triumph more consummate, never was defeat born with so ill a grace. Indeed, I could not endure the spectacle of the poor mummy's mortification. I reached my hat, bowed to him stiffly, and took leave. Upon getting home, I found it past 4 o'clock and went immediately to bed. It is now 10 a.m. I've been up since 7, penning these memoranda for the benefit of my family and of mankind. The former I shall behold no more. My husband is shrewd. The truth is, I am heartily sick of this life and century in general. I am convinced that everything is going wrong besides. I am anxious to know who will be president in 2045. As soon, therefore, as I shave and swallow a cup of coffee, I shall just step over to Pononers and get embalmed for a couple of 100 years.
So after all that, even after knowing that the mummy civilization had the technology and know-how to cheat death, even after being shot down with every so-called advancement they thought was an improvement, the two scientists could not even begin to fathom that he could have been their equal. Typical. In the end, rather than learn anything from this, our narrators decided that their knowledge is so important that they need to share it with those in the future. We have one final tale for you before we say goodbye. A short poem that Poe wrote to say goodbye to his dead wife. This is Spirits of the Dead as read by Farnaz Prosti.
Thy soul shall find itself alone, mid dark thoughts of the grey tombstone, not one of all the crowd to pry into thine hour of secrecy. Be silent in that solitude which is not loneliness, for then the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are gain, in death around thee, and their will shall then overshadow thee. Be still, for the night thou clear shall frown, and the stars shall look not down from their high thrones in the heaven, with light like hope to mortals given, but their red orbs without beam to thy awareness shall seem as a burning and a fever which would cling to thee forever. Now our thoughts thou shalt not banish, now our visions never to vanish from thy spirit. Shall they pass no more like dew drop from the grass? The breeze, the breath of God, is still, and the mist upon the hill, shadowy, shadowy, yet unbroken, is a symbol and a token, how it hangs upon the trees, and a mystery of mysteries.
Thank you so much for listening to BeFm Drama all this season. For those of you who have stuck with me through 40 episodes of Goblin Stories, 7 episodes of Werewolf Comedy, and 6 episodes of Edgar Allan Poe stories, I thank you sincerely. This project has been an amazing, fulfilling, and exhausting adventure. Now that it's all done, I'm gonna sleep for a long, long time. This was Some Words with a Mummy Part 2 and Spirits of the Dead by Edgar Allan Poe. They were read by Abe Puri, Farnaz Prosti, and me, Ryan Estrada. Path of the Goblin King, Tabuk, Return of the Mummy, Desert City, Ibn al-Nur, and Gnarled Situation are by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech and released under Creative Commons Attribution License. Thank you for listening to BeFm Drama.